So how do you use effects in the context of a production and a mix? We're going to look at reverb, modulation effects, things like delays and other ambient effects as well, and some of the different techniques and ways in which you can use these in the context of your mix, some of the choices you might make in terms of where you would use reverb and where you might not use reverb, how you might think about applying distortion and other more creative effects as well. And so for that we're going to turn to a Cubase project and have a look. So in this project we have a whole series of electronic sources. There are no real recorded elements here, and that perhaps makes it more important when it comes to choosing effects, particularly things like reverb and delay, because what you're doing is you're having to create a natural or an environment within which those sounds can fit. Now the reverb here actually gives a sense of depth to a mix, so it allows you to create a good sounding mix. Ones where elements are spaced from left to right, they appear close and further away, and each sound has its own space. So let's have a look at the mixer. You can see here that we've set up some effect sends. There are 3 for each of the sounds here. Let's play the track. Now I'm going to isolate the clap. So the clap and snare there. If I bring up the channel, you can see that I'm sending some of the sound to this Roomworks reverb. That's it off. Even a small amount can really help a sound fit into a mix. Let's have a look at the Roomworks plugin itself. So it's on Effect Send 1. We can see this over here. We can bring up the Roomworks reverb. I can increase the reverb time. Let's push the send up so you can hear that. Very, very long. We can change the diffusion, which changes the way in which the initial echoes are scattered to create the reverb tail. And we can choose the amount of low and high frequency content in the reverb there. And there's also a pre-delay, the delay before the onset of the reverb tail. Roomworks is a very simple plugin, but there are much more elaborate algorithmic style reverbs where you can change many, many more parameters. And they might use more processing and have what would be argued to be a better sound, a more realistic or a more satisfying sound coming out the other end. You also get impulse response-based reverbs. So those aren't algorithmic, these are ones which actually capture the sound of a real space. They're much more realistic, and they're sort of thing you might use, particularly when you're working with real instruments and you're trying to create a sense of real space. So now we're going to look at delays, and for that I'm going to actually apply a delay to a crash sound here. So if we solo the crash, and you can see here we have this ping-pong delay. The ping-pong delay essentially has a separate delay time left and right, so it appears that the sound bounces from left to right. We can set in this delay the delay time based on the note value, which takes its cue from the tempo. So this will be 8th note delays. It's applied to the crash, and you can hear it bouncing from left to right. As with the reverb, you can tailor the low and high frequency content. This has got a low filter and a high filter, which is applied to the delay. You can also push the feedback up, and what this does is it rotates the delay, so you actually get the delay output feeding back into the input. If I dropped feedback to 0, you just get the separate single delays coming back from the left and right. In this case, what I want to do also, because it's on an insert, I've chosen to keep the mix 50-50. So we get the dry signal going through and also the wet signal overlaid on top of that. If we push this up, then you only get the delay. You push that down to 0, you only get the dry signal. And this is something that when you're using effects on inserts, you do want to get that balance between the dry signal and the affected signal. So now we're going to look at other forms of effect and just run through a few different varieties. We've looked at reverbs and delays, so what else is there? If we drop down the menu here in Cubase, and you can see there's a whole series of effects coming through here. The amp simulator, auto panning, bit crushing, brick wall limiting, so we have these dynamic type of effects which actually change the dynamics of each individual sound. The chopper, which actually is a gate style, automatic gate type effect. Chorusing, which adds a nice kind of warmth, slightly modulated delay, is mixed with the original signal and helps thicken out the sound, give a little bit more interesting stereoimagery as well when you want to actually make a mono signal a little bit more, bit fuller. Tube style effects, so we have effects that actually emulate old school gear to hopefully warm it up a little bit. Distortion, EQs, filters, envelope shapers, lots of different types of effects here. I think it's worth bearing in mind that you need to be very careful about when and why you apply effects. One of the key things as well, I think, is that when you're using reverb and ambient effects, you don't go overboard. It's very much about the balance between different types of sounds. So for example, with reverb, try and keep reverb to the middling frequencies. Maybe don't apply it to sounds with lots of low frequency energy in, and also don't apply it to sounds with lots of high frequency energy in. That way you keep a crisp top end, and also you get a full and a very tight low end which doesn't have too much muddiness. Reverb can add muddiness. So if we look at some of these other effects, let's apply them to this low organ sound here. Now you can hear it's got some reverb from the ascend, and there's also a little bit of a delay in there as well. Let's take these off for the moment. Notice I've applied a compressor, which is a form of dynamic plug-in. But what happens if we apply a chorus? You can hear that slightly vibrato-esque type sound coming through there. That can be quite useful on pads and things like that, certainly. We can look at distortion. And what distortion does is you're actually adding some extra harmonics in there, so that harshness is coming from those added harmonics, but it can actually make a sound more interesting. What else do we have? Phaser. Again, this slightly associated with chorusing and flanging and things like that. This adds this slightly wavering quality in there. If you think about 1970s string machine sounds and things like that, pads, phasing was very, very popular on those, also on electric pianos as well of the era. It's important to note as well that effects can be used in many different kinds of ways, sometimes for corrective measures and sometimes for improving a sound, taking it somewhere quite different. And the other thing as well is that they can change the levels quite significantly. So you might find in the case of this phaser just now that levels drop, with distortion the levels might go up. So it's good practice to try and make sure that you maintain a reasonable signal level that doesn't waver too much when you're A-Bing between the dry signal and the wet signal. And that helps certainly when you come to mix a track and make sure everything fits together nicely and you don't start overloading things in inappropriate places.